Damilola Banjo, DAG Fellow. I have two questions, one to Deputy Secretary-General and the Special Advisor on Climate Action. One of the lines of conversations that I have noticed, and one that the Deputy Secretary-General mentioned earlier, is that different continents and countries within this continent have different interests and needs. As such, they require varying means to achieving the SDGs. In Nigeria, for example, 700,000 children under the age of 5 are at the risk of severe acute malnutrition. This number is more than doubled last year. Another 4.3 million are hungry. How can African countries, particularly Nigeria, move closer to achieving this goal as we approach the second half of the target? What should the continent be doing differently? My second question on climate. Countries in Africa, Asia, Middle East rely on fossil energy for economic development. How do you market clean energy to these countries whose sole or predominant revenue generation come from crude and coal? Thank you.
Great question from our DAG fellow. Look, the indices for Africa, country by country, are appalling on health, on education. I would say in my own country, Nigeria, education's in crisis. We're not only getting teachers that have not been invested in having the poor levels of teaching, but just millions of children that are either being left behind or even when they come out of school don't have the right. I think the new government has a huge challenge to try to put in policies that will strengthen from the local government and states up. We need to make accountable in Nigeria the 3 tiers of government. They've all got responsibilities for this. The 700,000 children that you're talking about is a local government and state responsibility. Now, we can provide the enabling policies for that, but in the end, the resources and the implementation will have to come from there. Now, can Nigeria afford, at the very basic level, education and health and nutrition for children? Yes, it can. But at the current moment, when there are many asks of the resources on Nigeria, it makes it very difficult. And I think that they will need to look at the way they handle their tax base, the way they handle the efficiencies in government between the 3 tiers to get that done. The international community has to respond because they will, even with the best will in the world in Nigeria, there'll still be a deficit. And that deficit needs to come from a means of implementation, whether we're talking about trade and the barriers and therefore the disruption of some of the supply chains that have happened that we've found difficult and expensive to recover. They will come from financing, whether we will continue to be able to hold the line on the debt that we have to repay. I think in the case of Nigeria's domestic debt, so a little easier, not much more easier to deal with. Technology, how fast we can move with that. Many of the things that Akim talked about with technology have provided an opportunity to leapfrog many things that we would have otherwise taken decades to do. Access to education, e-commerce, and Nigeria has a huge population that can move in leaps and bounds on that.
Thank you, and it's a great question, and it is a question that is at the heart of global efforts to address the climate crisis. We know the use of fossil fuels is the main cause of the climate crisis. And, you know, coal, oil, gas, it is absolutely clear that if we are to stand the fighting chance of limiting warming and protecting people in the developing world from the ravages of the climate crisis, we need to accelerate the global transition away from fossil fuels. But it must be just, fair, and equitable. And it must take into consideration the needs of the developing world. And what does this mean in very practical terms? It means that periods for transition for developing countries will need to be longer. And it means that the developed countries who have the capabilities, the capacities, the resources, they need to speed up their transition. So goes back to one of the questions earlier on the role of the G20. All G20 countries are not equal. And it is extremely disturbing that you see advanced economies among the G20 who committed to net zero, who committed to ambitious indices, are now issuing new oil and gas licensing at a time when the IEA, the IPCC, and others have clearly stated that this is incompatible with the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. And the same countries are then trying to lecture the global south on precisely the issue that you raise. So this is at the heart of what we're trying to solve here. How can we ensure that developing countries don't follow the same industrialized, dirty, polluting, industrialized pathway of the global north, that they are supported with finance and technology and capacity building really to undertake a just and a fair transition. And the Secretary General, he has called for a global solidarity pact building on the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, the South African model, and I know you might have different views on how that is going, my friend, Indonesia and Vietnam, where countries are supported with finance and technology to accelerate their transitions away from coal. Right? We know that renewables are now cheaper than fossil fuels in many parts of the world. But you have, in many developing country situations, this high cost of capital. Africa, despite its enormous renewable energy potential, 60% of the solar capacity globally is in Africa. Africa accounts for a mere 2% of the global investments in renewable energy. A lot of it is because of the risk perceptions that many private investors have in Africa and other parts of the developing world. Same technology. If you're looking to make an equity investment in Germany, it's probably 3-4%. In Nigeria, it's 19%. Right? So we really have to solve some of these challenges and remove some of these obstacles. But to precisely answer your question, the transition must happen if we're to address this climate crisis, but it must be just, fair, and the time frames will need to be differentiated for different types of countries and different categories of countries.
Thank you. Thank you so